Greetings, fellow maker. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made a giant inflatable shoe. Woo! The idea for this project came from Sean, known as Day 9, and Bill. We've been fans of Sean's work since way back when he got started, and we were having a conversation with him about possibly doing a costume for the Dota 2 International Tournament. What completely sold us on this build was the costume choice. Day 9 didn't just want to wear a character costume, he wanted to cosplay an item from the game, the Power Treads. We were like, you mean wear it like Mario wears a Goomba's shoe? And he clarified by drawing us this concept art. That's his head, and those are his feet. I was instantly sold on the idea, and the build didn't seem too challenging. Oh, past me is so dumb. This may be the most unusual costume I've made. And I ran into quite a few problems since a lot of the materials and techniques were new to me. To start the build, instead of making a full-size pattern, I did a small scale version that would get enlarged later. I used Sean's concept art to take measurements for the shoe dimensions. The design got refined a bit. We were originally going to build the shoe out of EVA foam, which we're pretty familiar with. Then I got the crazy idea to make an inflatable costume, since it had to be transported to the Dota 2 tournament in Canada. I used my handy 1/18 scale 3D print. Look at how tiny it is, for a scale reference. All the dimensions will later get multiplied by 18. The in-game reference was printed out to scale, and I sketched out the footprint. This was transferred to a sheet of plastic and then cut out on the scroll saw. A cardboard tube, slightly squished into an oval shape, marked the inner diameter where a person would fit. The inner circle was cut out, which will help with matching the bottom pattern to the inner cylinder pattern. Layers of crumpled aluminum foil, each getting hot glued into place, were used to form the Power Treads shape. If I needed more detail, I could have sculpted the shoe out of clay, but I just needed the base form. The straps and buckles would be added later. The surface was covered with a single sheet of foil that will also be the base layer of the pattern. I don't know why I hot glued it down, it was extra work to remove this later. I smoothed out the shoe as best I could, and the final shape looks pretty nice. The shoe was covered in 2 layers of masking tape. This is way easier to draw on than the foil. The base of the shoe and the inside of the cylinder were also covered. I tried to plan my seams to be hidden under the straps and shoe designs. The seams were drawn out, and I did have to add more seams after pulling off the pattern. It's hard to know which seams will have trouble laying flat. Registration marks should sort of help the pieces fit back together, although blowing up the scale 18 times bigger will result in very large marks. I forgot to add letters to mark which seams fit together, but I did add that later. That helped me remember where all the pieces fit together. I scaled down the width of the vinyl roll I'd be buying and laid out all the pattern pieces to see how many yards I need to buy. It's a good thing I did this because I would have totally underestimated. These pattern pieces are huge and I needed at least 12 yards. The registration marks were cut open as thinly as possible, and I got to break out our thrift store purchase, an old overhead projector. I could have used a pattern piece for scale, just multiplying one of the dimension lengths by 18, but it was more fun to use my minifigure. Also, the clear edges of this machining block were easier to view. At the store, there was a bunch of different thicknesses of transparent vinyl, but I wanted frosted vinyl. I was thinking of making the shoe light up, since the Power Treads in the game can be red, green, or blue. The only frosted vinyl was in 12 gauge thickness, so I just went with that. One side of this vinyl is shiny, and the other has the frosted texture, making it more matte. I didn't want the shiny look, so the matte side would be the outside of the boot. I did some tests on which markers would work for drawing my seam lines. The white marker worked the best, the black Sharpie stained the plastic, and I wanted to remove these lines after the patterns were stuck together, since these pieces are see-through. Also, I'm tracing these pieces onto the shiny side of the vinyl, which will be on my inside, so my templates on the projector are flipped upside down. This way, the marker lines won't be the ones glued together. The roll of vinyl was taped to the wall, and I started tracing out my pieces. When cutting them out, I left a seam allowance of at least an inch outside all of the edge lines. It's just like sewing. The pieces will be attached on the seam line, and the extra material is what gets glued together. What, you don't use glue when you're sewing? I also added the reference numbers and letters to each piece. This material definitely builds up a static charge, and the smaller pieces stuck to the wall on their own. The base Power Treads icon is a tan color, so I thought having a tan shoe would look nice. Like, if the lights stopped working, the base wouldn't look white. I decided to try a method similar to how we do visor tinting. I heated a pot of water to 180 degrees and dumped in a container of synthetic fabric dye. The vinyl was dropped into the dye, then rinsed off in water. The small scale tests went really well. I found that I only needed to have a piece in for about 5 minutes to get the tan color I wanted. The problem was the shoe patterns were big, really big. The crumpled vinyl wanted to stick to itself and got an inconsistent dye. Only the pattern pieces that would be on the outside of the shoe were dyed. No need to try and fit the giant inner cylinder pieces inside this tiny pot. After a few tries, I found that lightly folding the piece and then unfolding it before washing it in the water helped reduce the amount of wrinkles. Having a large, shallow tray would probably be way better for this process. Another problem I encountered was after dyeing a few pieces, the fabric dye lost the reddish color and only had a pale yellow left. I've never dyed multiple pieces like this before, so it didn't even occur to me to save some of the dye and pour in more in between each piece. Oh well, this was an interesting experiment and it was time to move on. I was afraid the vinyl would shrink in the heat, so I waited to add the seam lines until after. The vinyl seemed about the same size, maybe a little smaller since it was a bit wrinkly. For inflating the shoe, I had an old air mattress that had a few leaks in it. Thanks, Buddha, and I harvested the air attachment. The lower interior of the shoe seemed like a good place for the inflation point. Vinyl contact cement is kind of like barge, except it's more liquidy. This HH66 brand does an incredible job of bonding vinyl to itself. It does need to be adhered together between 2 to 5 minutes, and the bond isn't very strong at first. It needs to set for at least a few hours. It's just as toxic as barge, so I worked with the door open and wore my respirator the whole time. I attached the inflation system to the inside, the shiny side of the vinyl, then added an overlapping layer of scrap vinyl to the outside. I tried to smooth out any wrinkles, and this got easier with practice. My first long seam was kind of a mess. I tried applying the adhesive to both seams all the way down the piece all at once. The vinyl slightly curls and wants to stick to itself. I found it was easier to work in small batches, only doing 6 to 12 inches at a time. It was also easier to roll the top seam onto the bottom seam. This resulted in fewer wrinkles. I always made sure my seams were pressed together really well. This thing needs to be airtight after all. After I completed a big piece, I used isopropyl alcohol to wipe away the seams and registration marks. This is why I drew the seams on the inside of the pattern. Otherwise, they would be partially trapped inside the glued up seam. The gluing process took quite a while, and I went through 2 of the 8-ounce cans of vinyl cement. But finally, my large garbage bag was assembled. It's time to test the inflation. There's a couple things I'm really worried about. If there's little leaks in it, I think that's fine. I think I'll be able to patch them, but if the seams completely pull apart, then that might be it for this project. One thing I won't be able to fix is if it inflates and it doesn't look like a shoe anymore. It might just be a lumpy mess. I might have messed up the pattern along the way, or maybe just the design of it can't look like a shoe anymore. But there's only one way to find out.
Fill it up.
Fill it up, fill it up, fill it up. When you're getting started with making, it's tricky to figure out how to start building a template or a pattern. So to help you out, we have a collection of free templates over on our website. They range from front and side views of props all the way to a complete Skyrim steel armor set. If you're looking for a generic base helmet pattern, Bill did a video tutorial on how to make one and also has the template available for sale up on our store. So head on over to punishprops.com to check those out. That's not what I expected at all. Oh no. Look at that, it all came together, which, I mean, kind of makes sense when you think about it. I have a hard time wrapping my head around stuff like that. I mean, I'm happy that it, from the profile, looks like a shoe. I mean, that's just ridiculous looking. It's not room for a person in it anymore. Extra points to you if you notice this issue from the beginning of my build. Normal pool toys will have dividers inside the inflated pieces, keeping things where they need to be. Ideally, it would have been great to add a bunch of strips vertically along the cylinder, connecting the outer wall to the inner wall at a set thickness. But that would have taken more time than I had. I hope just a couple of tabs would help keep the inflated interior in place well enough to at least fit into. This was a real pain to do after it was already assembled. I had to cut into the interior, glue a tab onto the inside of the exterior surface, and then seal up my interior cut. They all ended up pretty messy and wrinkly, and I did end up putting another full strip of reinforcement vinyl over the cut seam. It turns out with this design, I accidentally made one of those doctor's blood pressure arm checker things, where when you inflate it, the inside collapses in on itself. It's one of those things that makes perfect sense now, but it didn't even occur to me that that would be an issue. I went ahead and added some tabs connecting the inside to the outside. I have 2 on top, 1 in the back, 2 lower ones on either side, and 1 up here. I don't know if that's going to be enough, but I let it set for a couple hours. I'm going to try inflating it now, and if it looks like I'm going to need more, I'll just keep adding more. It did help, but I added some more tabs in the middle and another on the back. But could a human fit in there? It kind of works. Definitely feel like I need some handles or something. The fit is a little snug, like those pool arm floaties, but it looked like it would be usable. I removed the handles off an old exercise band to attach to the interior of the shoe. These were originally attached with only 1 strip of vinyl, but I added more reinforcing strips after one handle broke free. With the shoe inflated, it was time to add all of the straps and buckle decorations. I had this beat-up sheet of L200 foam that would be perfect for this project. Usually this type of foam is too squishy for my liking, but it would work for these buckles since I'm not even painting them. The edges were cleaned up with a sanding drum on my rotary tool, and I also made the inner buckle pieces. Oh, by the way, I know the buckles on the artwork are kind of backwards and don't look like they could function, but I wanted to copy the design as best I could. Plus, these things aren't going to be real working buckles. I bought some stretchy fabric from the Yaya Han line that has a nice silver color. Pieces were cut out, leaving plenty of room to wrap the fabric around the edges. This is my first time trying this method, so I went with hot glue, which held pretty well to the fabric. Not great though. The edges were stretched one section at a time, making sure any wrinkles weren't visible from the sides or the front. The back of this buckle won't be seen, so it's okay if it looks like a wrinkly mess. Just like any other technique, I think I need more practice with wrapping fabric, but I was happy with how it turned out. I bought upholstery vinyl for all of the straps. This fabric keeps its shape really well and doesn't get all wrinkly, and it was on sale. But I probably should have gone with something that weighs less. This material weighs as much as the entire vinyl shoe. Not a really big deal unless you're trying to keep your costume inflated. These little clips worked really well with this material. Normal pins would have been a nightmare. Barge contact cement bonds vinyl to foam pretty well, so I used that to attach the buckles to the straps. Back in the day for the Shaq's costume, I bought way too much fur, and now I had a chance to use it. Scrap upholstery foam was hot glued inside the fur, making a big fluffy sausage. I sewed vinyl strips onto the fur and the top shoe strap. Just a couple of small tabs of vinyl, and then I attached those straight to the boot. Most of these straps will be free floating around the inflated form. Throughout this entire process, I was battling air leaks. It seemed like every time I patched one, another leak would appear. They were along the seam line too, which I thought was really weird. Then I think I figured it out. My vinyl adhesive application wasn't even, which normally wasn't a big deal. The contact cement will only bond when the other surface has cement on it as well. But occasionally there would be a little bit of cement on both sides of the seam, bonding together higher up than the rest of the seam. When the seam is pulled apart, there's a lot of pressure on just that one little area, and the bond tears free on one side, leaving a little hole behind. This was a game breaker. I needed the costume to stay inflated to be a costume. As a last-ditch effort, I grabbed one of those fans from the goofy inflatable costumes, like those T-Rexes. The fan is designed to continuously keep a costume inflated, but those costumes are made from lightweight fabric, and I didn't know if this fan would be enough. Only one way to find out. The entire fan system is supposed to be inside the costume, so I had to cut a hole and a seam to fit the whole fan inside, then pulled out the battery cord and sealed up the edges. The fan part does have a screw-on gasket, which was super handy. I used the air mattress fan to get the shoe most of the way inflated and then turned on the continuous fan. It actually worked. The fan did make angry noises whenever I pressed on the shoe, so I don't know how long it's gonna last. It might burn out. But after coming this far, I wanted to finish the costume. The rest of the straps were sewed and clipped in place. I hand-stitched on the connection areas, which was pretty scary to do next to an inflatable. The front toe was patterned one seam at a time and then attached to the rest of the straps. For the lights, I bought a kit that came with 12-volt RGB LEDs and a neat color-changing remote. The system is supposed to plug into the wall, but instead I used a rechargeable battery, the same one we used for the Probius build. I had part of a purse left over from a previous project and sewed it into the top of the shoe. This is where the LED battery and the remote would be stored. Also a place to keep spare AA batteries for the fan. That little fan was only lasting about 4 hours. I wrapped the LEDs around the inside of the straps. They have adhesive backing, but it didn't stick super well, so later I reinforced it with hot glue. The lighting looks really great when looking at the LEDs all the way through the vinyl, but couldn't really be seen on the side facing me. I wanted the lights to be more noticeable, so I chose to put the LEDs on the edge of the straps. I thought the hot spots were better than not being able to see the lights at all. And after all of that trial and error, the power treads were complete. This project was a crazy learning experience, and hopefully you can take what I've learned to help you make your own larger-than-life costume, or maybe an inflatable prop. I don't know if the vinyl adhesive is a good idea for large inflatable props. It was really hard to keep the seams clean with something that large, but maybe for a smaller prop it would work out. To make things like pool toys in the industry, they do something called heat welding, and I couldn't get that to work at home. I couldn't get a good bond using an iron to melt the two seams together. But if any of you out there have experience with heat welding at home and have any advice or links to video tutorials, please share them down below, and hopefully that will help anyone who wants to try that process. If you like Let's Plays and video game tournament videos with hilarious commentary, go check out Day9's videos on YouTube. Sean also has really great Musings videos where he shares helpful knowledge and goes over life in general. One of my favorite videos of his is called Being Relentlessly Positive, and I'll link that down below. I did record an extra credits video going over the origin story of this costume and more details on the thought process throughout the build. That's over on patreon.com/punishprops. As of recording this video, I don't actually know if the costume worked out. The entire build is hinging on that little battery-powered fan to keep the whole thing inflated. After I get word of the success or epic failure of the costume, I'll let you guys know in a pinned comment down below how it went. Thank you for watching this wonderfully wacky build video, and I'll see you next time.